working with Jonathan Keats, who's an artist who focuses a lot on time. And so we have a collaboration in the food space there where we can take each city on Earth, and with Matt Fitzpatrick and other scientists, we can say what existing city the future climate of that city is going to be like. And so for Raleigh in 2100, it's cities like in central Florida or the sort of Caribbean coast of Mexico. Scientifically, like that's the science part. We've done it. But the making meaning of that in a broader way, we have to think about culture and psychology and these other places. And the art comes in there. And Jonathan is really leading us to think about what does this mean about the hybrid foods of the future? So what can grow around Raleigh in 2100? And what cultures are those foods associated with? And how do we confront our current food ways with these hybrid ways that are coming? And we then get into these interesting spaces between the academic and the art, where there's something that appeals to my aesthetic. And so in this case, like the high food version appeals to me. What's the high food that cuisine that we could do? And on the artist side, Jonathan's really clear that no, if we want to provoke a broader conversation, it's way more like hot dogs or barbecue. It is these foods that are so tightly connected to culture that the provocation is bolder and means something different. And so that's useful to me too, to be reminded when I'm retreating to my aesthetic, my disciplinary aesthetic.
Yeah.
At the institutional level, we're trying to think about what does it look like to support these kinds of partnerships in a broader way. And I don't know yet.
Yeah.
Because they take a special kind of artist and then they take scientific comfort with the uncomfortable things. They take a comfort with the recognition that the science on its own might not be doing what the world needs. And so I think if we try to do it institutionally in just this very structural way, like I'm not sure it'll work.
Yeah.
And so how do we bring scientists to the table who are willing to be part of this conversation with artists who are also willing? You know, I'm very interested in that question, and I don't know that I have an answer to it yet.
Yeah. What is the response from the scientific community, if there's any sort of response to this?
I think there's a response we're supposed to have, which is that I think it's different in the US, let's say, that people feel compelled to say that the art is over here and that they're scientists and they're supposed to do science. Very often, my writing life, I find that like when I go give a talk at a university, there's a group of people that come up and tell me about their secret novels at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Never been to a university where that isn't true. And almost always like really filthy romance novels.
Okay.
Whatever that means. I think in the same way, there are lots of scientists who are really interested in art. And so it's there, but it's not part of their work world.
Yeah.
They've not connected those two elements. I think in parts of Europe, it's quite different.
Okay. What would you see as a good model for integrating this? What are the exemplars, or how would you, if you could wave a magic wand and change things here, what could that healthy integration look like?
I'll give you an example. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that in a big way, and I hope you can find it for me. An example was we had a bunch of scientists. We've pushed scientists here to think about the farther future, not just 5 years, but 10, 20, 50. And one of the things we see is that what scientists are most comfortable with is a technological future embodied in their discipline. They're comfortable talking about that, but they're not comfortable talking about where that sits in society. And so I think that might be a really healthy way for us to think structurally about some partnerships. And so what does it look like to get the scientists to think 10, 20, 30, 40 years in the future, and then to bring the artists in the conversation to think about how do we think about this? I think that's one model. The other is I'm working with speculative fiction writers some, and it's like usefully awkward. Like we haven't figured out how to work together yet. But one of the things I see on the science side is that we have the climate change scenarios that we talk about all the time. And so those are futures grounded in models, but they're alternate futures, right? In the same way that speculative fiction writers would think about alternate futures. But there's no humanity in them. They are futures that are entirely about emission scenarios. And so people can't relate to them. They don't remember which one is which. And so it's how does RCP 4.5 relate to the society we're going to have? We've had a bunch of conversations to think about how do we bring writers into this. I think that the way to make it work and come back in a year is to start with the writers and to have a group of writers partner with a scientist. And the writer's task is to imagine different different, better futures, not utopian necessarily,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
we need help with the better.
Yeah. Yeah.
But to have the scientists inform the possible. And so we had a conversation a couple of weeks ago where I was pushing our geneticists who do genetic engineering to tell me, like, well, what does the possible look like? There's a lot of latent possible, like, that they don't like to talk about. They don't get asked to talk about.
Sure.
And so one of the things that came up, it's like one of our very successful, really impressive scientists was like, I wake up all the time worried about the reality that within 10 years, we'll be able to extend human telomeres, and in doing so, allow people to live 200 or 300 years. And it really worries me who we are going to allow to live that long.
Yeah.
We're not talking about that. Like,
Yeah.
we're having no conversations about that. And the speculative fiction writers aren't really writing about it. And can I create a structural way to pair the writers with these futures that are, I don't know the right word, Brandon, but implied by the technology,
Sure.
or
Afforded, right?
afforded. Yeah, afforded is the right
Yeah.
word.
Yeah.
Afforded by the technology.
Yeah. Wow.
And so I think it's going to be like people won't know how to work together. But my hope is like we can try enough versions of that we could
Yeah.
start to find a way.
Brilliant. Yeah.
Yeah, but I don't know. What do you think? What do
Yeah.
you think the ideal would look like?
No, I have no idea, but it's just punching to you. I mean, but I've been really curious as to this, how to overcome this two cultures problem that C.P. Snow talked about, and the humanities and the sciences being in their own kind of silos, which I think figuring out ways to have these kinds of conversations where people work on things together in some way seems to be the right way to do it. I just haven't seen, institutionally, I haven't seen any good models. So I think it's one thing to have initiatives like your lab. It's something else to have more conversation in an academic institution or across fields where there is this sort of, there's value to this. I don't know what the incentive structure would be, what the funding structure would be either. But I think you're raising some really crucial issues. To imagine the future, you need to know both the science and to have the artistic ability to do that. I want to pivot a bit and ask you about a natural history of the future. I was really struck by the incredible resilience that you're showing in the book, the adaptability of nature. And I think at the outset, you have the megaplate experiment, which is, I wouldn't call beautiful in its implications anyway, but perhaps it's good fit for purpose. So it's beautiful in that sense, but certainly a very grotesque, horrifying example. Could you talk about the example, why you started with that and what it means for the argument you're making?
Yeah, and I'll say that I think the aesthetic component of that experiment, I mean, it is a science experiment, but the aesthetic is really an important feature of it.
Yeah.
So I'll describe it visually. It looks a little bit like a Rothko painting, right? So it's a giant petri dish. It's like a meter, and it's filled with agar so bacteria can grow on it. And the agar is in columns. And at the end, the agar is just bacteria, food, and house, right? Like nothing else in it. And as you go toward the center, these Rothko painted columns have more and more antibiotic in them. And so you get to the middle, it's like a super toxic, apocalyptic concentration of antibiotic. And the experiment is about how fast the bacteria evolve resistance to the antibiotic. And so the bacteria are introduced in the end columns, and they can go toward the middle. And at the beginning, they have no ability to move through those additional columns because they're not resistant to the antibiotic. And so the only way for them to move through is to evolve resistance. And so what you see unfold in real time over 12 days, if memory serves, then you can fast forward to watch it sped up, is the bacteria very quickly go from that first column that's free of antibiotics to the second one with a low concentration of antibiotics. And many different individual little clumps of bacteria do it, reflecting that in many times independently, they're evolving the ability to move across into that next column. And so then they fill that next column. And not very long after, they move into the column after that, until very quickly, the bacteria have evolved the ability to live in this toxic soup of antibiotics right in the middle. For me, the aesthetic there is what makes that work. I would call it sublime. I think it's the terrible sublime.
Yeah.
It is the same sucking sound as the universe, right? Like that
Right.
there's something. But if it was a petri dish this big, visually you could show the same thing. But it's the awareness that this is a scale that's about the size of a human body that I think changes it. I think visually being able to see a process that we think of as being from deep time, like that's an aesthetic change. It's a change of a time frame. In retrospect, they talk about a little bit the aesthetic features of this, and they were inspired by an advertisement sign to do this. But I think they were aware that what they were doing was partially about the science and partially about the aesthetics and the art.
Yeah.
And so to me, that it's actually a really intriguing case because there's not an artist involved, but it is a provocation. And if I show it in a slide deck to an audience, it triggers a really strong emotional response. And so in that way, I don't know, it happens to be science, but it is also in its power art, I think. Did it strike you as science? How did you read it?
Yeah, no, I think both certainly. Yeah, but I think I was more struck by the sense in which we're trying to eliminate bacteria and we think we can do it and we can't.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of just being struck by how indomitable nature is. It's just, and I think we have this conceit that we're not part of nature, right? That we think we're something outside of it. And there is that, our ability to transcend it to some degree, but I think so much of our technology and even just the way in which we live our lives is premised on that conceit that we are above and not part of nature.
World, like let's share this. His gut microbiome came from his mom's body during birth, right? His bacteria on his skin are in an active evolutionary war with the viruses that attack those bacteria. His immune system is interacting with all the species around him every day, even if he pays no attention to them.
Yeah.
And so there's a way in which like consciousness here is part of what distances us. All the stuff that sits we think of as sitting in our head. Meanwhile, the rest of our body is just disconnected. And so like that disconnect is really fascinating to me. The body knows where it is. The body knows what it's missing in some level. And that our conscious brains are like, no, I'm in a room alone. There's no other species here. And if I draw a future, I'm going to draw fancy buildings and technology.
Right.
As long as we got enough engineers, we're cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Turns out that's problematic.
That's not even who we are. Yeah. No, it's incredible. Yeah. I think our discovering the microbiome and realizing we are actually more than just solitary individuals has been groundbreaking for a lot of people.
Well, and just to butt in, Brandon, like we've discovered it twice. We knew about it in 1909, and people who studied termites picked it up from people who studied humans. In 1909, we knew that babies were acquiring gut microbes from their moms during birth, and they needed them.
Wow.
And we just ignored it for humans.
Wow.
And my hypothesis would be it's so at odds with this Western sensibility of the lonely human out on their own.
Yeah.
You know, John Wayne and the microbiome don't interact well.
So I want to ask though about that sort of solitary, the illusion that we have. So one of the things we learned from the scientists we talked to is that most of them see science as essentially the pursuit of what we're calling the beauty of understanding. And so grasping behind patterns and appearances, the hidden order or inner logic of things, right? And that's really the business of science for most of them. And yet there are others who argue that that's a naive way to depict it. Science is really about violence. It's about conquest. So it's not really, even though scientists light up when they talk about discovery, there is the project of Western science, people would argue, a violent project of conquest, man over nature sort of thing. I wonder what your reaction is to that. To what extent is science about violence or conquest? And I mean, particularly in relation to what you're arguing in your book, how should science proceed if that's really been the trajectory?
I think it's a yes and situation. It would be interesting to imagine if we could create a system of scholarship at a national or global level that would work really differently. What would it work like? That's an interesting thought experiment. That clearly we need a system for making more sense of the world in order to act in the world. We've got a 10 billion person experiment going on that requires us to be able to control a huge proportion of Earth's resources for our benefit. And I don't know another way to do that. I would also say on the positive and negative is too simple, but for lack of a better frame, on the positive side, it is also the science that allows us to see our place, to be reminded of that humility if we're willing to be reminded. And to me, Western science is one of the most powerful reminders of how small we are in the context of the rest of the living world. It is also a structure that reinforces our inability to notice that. So formally, it's science that's told us there might be 1 trillion bacteria species, even though we only know 30,000. Right now, you're breathing in most of the species you're breathing in, no one's ever named or studied. And that is a humble moment before the universe. There's no structural element in Western science for humility. Humility is individual, not part of the system. And so I think that's an interesting feature. And then Western science sits atop this history of conquest, this history of religion. Scientists aren't terribly comfortable talking about the colonial parts of science. They're really uncomfortable talking about the fact that the reemergence of Western science in the Renaissance context emerges in a religious context. Even the names we have for parts of the university, like the provost, they're actually the religious names for these entities. The whole scholarly endeavor is connected to that religious endeavor. And to me, there are lots of parts of this that should invite constant revision, but revision in light of how do we take where we are and what we need to do collectively, globally, and imagine a system that has better features. Because I think the wholesale critique, late at night, I can embrace some of the wholesale critique of what we're doing, but in the morning, I'm still going to make a plan.
Yeah.
And so reconciling those elements, and there's an amazing, I'm going to forget a name right now, but the science and technology scholar at the University of Michigan, first name Shobita, and I'm going to forget Shobita's last name, unfortunately. And she's done great work thinking about how would you reimagine the funding system to make the benefits of science more just. And so I think that's the other thing we can be doing, is that this is not, science is not this, it's not divorceable from the system, from the architecture of funding, from the architecture of who we value and why. And we can change that architecture. And so we can change our funding systems. And what would it look like to fund science in a way that made more sense? And I think that can be with regard to justice, with regard to equity, but it can also be with regard to being better at making discoveries. And so I think there's room for all those kinds of intervention.
Yeah.
So I don't think there's a simple answer to that
Sure.
frame, but I think it's useful to be reminded that the same thing can be in search of beauty and connected to horror.
Yeah. Beauty at Work is brought to you by Templeton Religion Trust. If you enjoyed this clip, go check out the full episode. And please take a moment to subscribe and leave us a review. It really helps get the word out about the show. Thanks, and see you next time.